The general vanity makes it so that they say only of those they know how to live, who never understand how to live for themselves. Immanuel Kant. I've now given several lectures on the topic of happiness and the good life in Kant's thinking. And all in all, what I explained is that Kant's doctrine of the good life is more a negative one than a positive one, meaning he would rather talk about what you shouldn't do in order to prevent being unhappy, rather than what you should do in order to be happy. And that is typical of Kant. That is not just true for his teaching of the good life. I already addressed that in previous lectures, like my lecture on metaphysics and my lecture on the conflict of faculties, that to Kant, philosophy is mostly negative, mostly telling us what not to do, mostly telling us where our limits are, like the limits of our knowledge. And this is also, Kant would say, what many people take issue with, because they prefer a positive message, so to say. They prefer being told what to do rather than being told what not to do. This is what to Kant makes the conflict of the faculties. Back in his day, the universities were made up of 4 faculties. The 3 higher faculties of theology, jurisprudence, and medicine, and the lower, the basic faculty of philosophy. I made a whole lecture on the conflict of faculties, which I very much advise you to check out if you want to get Kant, because I would say that this conflict, this, you could say, antagonism between philosophy and the other faculties is a key to understanding Kant, to understanding what philosophy means to him and what his philosophical project is. And there in the conflict of faculties, you precisely have this antagonism between positive and negative teaching. So take the conflict with the medical faculty, where Kant says the physician, his job is mostly therapy, so helping you to get healthy again when you are sick. But the philosopher, as a healer, and I also gave a lecture about that, his job is mostly the diet, is mostly to tell you, while you are still healthy, how to live your life in order to stay healthy, in order not to become sick. But people often prefer the former. They want to live a mindless, unhealthy life, eat unhealthy fast food all the time, take drugs, get drunk, smoke, whatever. And then they run to the physician and want the magic pill, so to say, that makes all their sickness go away again. And they prefer that over the philosopher telling them, well, stay away from this unhealthy lifestyle, then you probably won't get sick in the first place. And this, of course, is true for the topic of happiness too. People would prefer positive teaching of happiness. They prefer someone telling them, oh yeah, if you have lots of money, you will be happy, or if you find a partner for life, you will be happy, or whatever, rather than someone telling them what not to do. But this is what Kant mostly does, and what I did in my previous lectures. Kant would say, don't get into affections and passions. So don't allow a feeling and don't allow a desire to completely overtake you and to rob you of your own reason. Kant also says, and there he is somewhat in line with the Stoics, that you should strive for a certain equanimity, that you should take things to heart, meaning you should let them move you. You should not be indifferent, but you should not let things affect your mood. You should not be overly sensitive and like an instrument that anyone can play on. Rather, the things that happen in life, the up and down of life, the coincidences of fate, they should not affect you too much. I also talked about Kant's Epicureanism, that he says, sure, you can satisfy your desires, you can go after pleasure, you don't have to live completely ascetic and completely deprive yourself of all pleasures, but you should take care not to let your desires become inclinations, which to Kant means a necessary desire that rules you. You should not depend on the things of the world for your happiness. So when something pleasurable happens in life, you can be happy about it, you can enjoy it, but you should be able to live without it. So overall, you should live a modest life. You should try to enjoy the simple pleasures in life. Even just the fact that there's no pain, the fact that you are healthy, rather than seeking luxury and making yourself dependent on that. And lastly, I talked about the posture of practical idealism, that Kant says theoretically it's not true that the world is just a dream, that nothing is real, but practically in the way you act, you should act as if it was true. In other words, you should not take the world too seriously. You should treat life sort of like a game. The only thing you should take seriously is your own morality. Therefore, the only thing that should ever pain you is your own misdeeds, when you have a bad conscience. But everything else you should not take too seriously. So when something bad happens to you or to someone else in life, okay, there might be physical pain, but there's no need to reflect about it in a way that also leads to misery. There's no need to, on top of feeling bad, also feel bad for yourself for feeling bad. Instead, what Kant advocates for, what a wise person has, according to him, is the constantly cheerful heart. All of this, as I said, I discussed in my previous lectures. All of this is Kant's negative teaching of happiness. But before I finish the sole topic of the good life, I want, in this one last lecture dealing with that topic, I want to stress that there is also a sort of positive doctrine of happiness to be found in Kant's writings. And this is what I want to talk about here. Before I get into that specifically, we can ask more generally, where could happiness or where could pleasure even come from? What would be the possible sources of pleasure? And this is where, once again, as I have done in previous lectures, I will point out the merit of studying Kant, even beyond just getting familiar with and learning from Kant's philosophy. Because, as I said previously, Kant really did lay the foundation for all philosophy. He is a very systematic, a very architectonic thinker. He does not just offer opinions that might or might not be correct, that might or might not be interesting or deep, like other thinkers may, but rather he deals with principles. And so therefore I would advise to anyone who wants to systematically study philosophy, to start with getting an understanding of Kant, because through this he will not just understand Kant himself, but also he will better understand other thinkers, even all possible thinking, not just the thinking that has already been done, but also the thinking that might be done in the future. Because when it comes to this topic of happiness and the source of it, there's two possible sources. Because, as I've explained in many of my previous lectures, to Kant, humans are creatures that are both sensual and intellectual creatures. And unlike others that might only be one or the other, right? Animals are only sensual to him, God is only intellectual, but humans are both. And sensuality by Kant is always defined as receptivity. So a sort of passivity. You are sensual when you just receive certain sensations, certain impressions. So when you look at something red, you see red. When you put something sweet in your mouth, you taste the sweetness. When you cut yourself somewhere, you feel pain. All of these are not representations you can just create yourself, right? You cannot just will yourself to taste the sweet taste in your mouth if you are not eating anything right now. And all of these are also representations you cannot simply get rid of, right? If you look at something red, you cannot help but seeing red. Maybe you would rather see something blue, but this cannot be done. Of course, you can look away, you can close your eyes, but if the sensation is affecting you, then you will have that sensation, whether you like or not. That is sensuality. It is receptivity. On the other hand, intellectuality to Kant is defined as spontaneity or self-activeness. So our intellect, our thinking is active, right? You can choose to think of something, to think of a certain concept. You bring force that's soaked in yourself. It's not necessarily caused by something from the outside. Rather, you bring it force yourself. And so, if we have this distinction of sensuality and intellectuality, of receptiveness and self-activeness, then it stands to reason that there's only two, in the most general sense, only two possible sources of pleasure. There is a passive, a sensual pleasure, and there is an active pleasure that we produce ourselves. And most of the time when people think of pleasure and therefore also of happiness, they will only think of the former. They will think of pleasure where they are receptive. So something is happening to them, whether I'm eating tasty food or whether I'm having sex or whatever. But something is happening to me. Something is affecting me. Something is causing certain pleasurable sensations in me. And in that sense, I am passive. In that sense, I am indulging. I am in a sense just consuming here. I'm just being a receptor for pleasurable feelings. And as I explained previously, Kant would say that this kind of pleasure is always fleeting. It cannot ever bring lasting happiness. And this kind of pleasure also, with time, when I repeat it, makes me go numb. And therefore it becomes less pleasurable. Therefore it forces me to seek out other pleasures. Yet it is this what the unaufkläred people seek. And I would say that is for a very simple reason. What does it mean to be unaufkläred? It means not leading yourself, but rather being led. Most people here always think of being led in your thinking by other people, having other people tell you what to think. That is what not thinking for yourself means to most. But it also means being led, being passive, being a victim in a much more fundamental sense, being led by your own senses, being led by the things, by the world around you. And this is the case here. Most people can think of no other pleasure than eating, fucking, partying, laying in the sun, taking drugs, or if you want more refined pleasures. There's really no difference here. You can also read a book or go to a concert or whatever. The point is still the passivity. Most people want to be passive. So of course they will also be active because they have to be, right? But the activity will always be considered a means to an end. Of course, when I'm eating, there's some activity needed, even if I didn't buy the food myself, even if I didn't cook the food myself, I will probably at least put it into my mouth myself. Likewise, when I'm having sex, sure, that usually involves some sort of activity. Also, of course, people go to work to earn money in order to buy whatever they think they need for their happiness. But with all of this, the activity is a means to an end. And if I could reach the end without the activity, then I would probably gladly do without the activity, right? If I could just feel full and feel good tastes in my mouth without having to actually bother with putting food into my mouth, then I would probably take that. If people could probably just will themselves to have an orgasm without needing sexual activity, they would maybe do it. If people could just get money, if you could just win the lottery or whatever, and have enough money to be rich and to never need to work again, then maybe you would do it. You're not working for work's sake. You are working because it's, so to say, a necessary evil, right? So in a sense, you are working in order to not have to work, right? The point of your life, to many people, is not the work, but it's the weekend, or it's the vacation, or it's the retirement. You're just working so that you can spend more time not having to work. And this is, of course, because as sensual beings, we have a sort of natural laziness. I will talk about what laziness means to Kant and where it comes from in its own lecture, when I get to talk about what Kant says about Aufklärung, because laziness along with cowardice is the reason for people being unaufklärt, for people not thinking for themselves. But for now, it's enough to simply state that we are lazy by nature. We have this natural inertia, you could say, which is also, by the way, why Kant says that without some sort of force, people usually don't become active. People usually don't work, right? So therefore, Kant says, if you want to do some sort of work for whatever reason, it's good if force is involved. So if we are talking about the work that is your job, then there is force involved. You're compelled to do it because you need to earn money, right? In the morning you might not feel like getting up and going to work and doing your job, but you do it anyways because otherwise you would get fired and you would not make money and you would become homeless. But for that very reason, if it's not your job, if you're not earning money from it, so if there's no sort of compulsion, you might be less inclined to do it, right? So maybe you work as a cleaner, and so at your job you clean in order to earn money, but then at home you let everything get dirty because you're too lazy. Or maybe your job is being a gardener, and in order to earn money you do your job diligently, but then at home you are too lazy to water your plants and you let them all die, right? Which is why Kant suggests to, if you do want to do a certain work, like let's say water your plants because you do want to have plants, to make sure there is some sort of force, some sort of compulsion you create for yourself, right? Which is why I have advised people, okay, in the morning when your alarm rings, you just turn off your alarm and then roll onto the other side and keep sleeping. If that keeps happening, then maybe put the alarm not right next to your bed where you can just turn it off. Put it on the other side of the room, so you force yourself to get up in order to turn it off. And once you're already up, then maybe you won't go back into bed so easily, right? Or I've told someone, okay, you want to learn a language, get yourself into a language class or get yourself a teacher, a private tutor, whatever. But don't do it on your own, because while of course it is possible to teach yourself a language, it needs more diligence, because your laziness might kick in and you might not feel like studying today, and then you don't feel like studying tomorrow, and so on. But if you have a class or a teacher and you have certain hours where you have an appointment with them, and you also paid money for it, then maybe you are more compelled to actually go there. So it's about tricking yourself and tricking your own laziness in a way, right? Like myself, for example, in order to be able to do what I'm doing here, I have read all 29 volumes of Kant's works in less than a year. I read 100 pages of Kant every day. And then I also wrote hundreds of pages about it, right? It's not just these lectures I'm giving. I also wrote books about Kant, just in German for now, unfortunately. Of course, I'd be happy if they were translated one day. But the point is, I did that, but what I did is I didn't do it at home. I always went somewhere else, where there was nothing else for me to do, where there was no internet to distract me or whatever. So when I'm there with just my laptop and just my Kant books, then I sort of have to do this, right? There's nothing else to do. Of course, I could get up and go home, but apart from that, I'm sort of forced to work here. So sort of trick your own laziness, Kant would say. Sort of create some sort of compulsion for yourself. But anyways, what the unaufklärt people want is to, in a way, not really be alive. Because, and this is also something I will discuss further when I get to what Kant says about natural science. There I will also talk about what he has to say about biology. But I can already say here to Kant, life is activity. Life is moving yourself, right? Something dead is only moving when it's moved, right? A stone moves when you kick it, but not on its own. But something alive, like an animal, moves itself. So this tendency of laziness, of inertia, is in a way a tendency towards death. In a way, unaufkläred people don't want to truly be alive. They want to be like a dead piece of matter, like a dead stone or something. And so their dream of happiness is a passive happiness, is a state where they don't have to act at all anymore. This is something what Nietzsche noticed and what he called the Sabbath of Sabbath. This is what the people want. They are dreaming of the Sabbath of Sabbath. In many different contexts, like an individual might dream of retirement and then just being able to indulge in whatever pleasures he like, not having to work anymore. And some people might want to speed that up, to do that earlier. They might try to invest in stock or in Bitcoin or whatever, dreaming of generating enough passive income to not having to work anymore. On a more social level, utopias are often about that. If you think about how people imagine an utopia, like socialists, for example, they might dream of the classless society where not much work is needed anymore, and they can sort of do their own thing. They can, so to say, take an eternal break. In religious context, and this is how many people imagine the afterlife, imagine heaven, imagine paradise. Not having to act anymore, not having to do anything anymore, just sitting around in a nice garden, being served by beautiful virgins or whatever, just passively indulging. Now, most people will think of this Sabbath of Sabbath in one way or another automatically when thinking of lasting happiness. They can't even imagine another happiness. But Nietzsche has very clearly shown us that this is a dream of weaklings. If you are weak, if life, and again, life means being active, life means doing, Kant would say. Nietzsche himself describes life as will to power, will to expand, will to grow, will to subjugate. If life to you feels overwhelming, if everything is always too much, if you feel a lack of your own power, if you feel unable to deal with the challenges of life, then of course your greatest dream will be taking a break, being allowed to rest, not having to deal with this challenging and overwhelming life anymore. But what is a dream to the unaufkläred and the weak is actually a nightmare to the aufkläred and the strong. Because if you're strong, if you are abundant, if you're overflowing, then you will want to do, you will want to be active, you will actually not want to just lounge around, you will ask for tasks, for responsibility, for doing more and ever more, and in each thing you do, you will feel your power, your abundance growing, and therefore you will want to do even more. And if such a person thinks of a life after death, then even in that case, they will have a completely different concept of it. To them, it will not be the Sabbath of Sabbath, eternal rest. Rather, if you look, for example, at Fichte's philosophy, his idea is that we have a task here in this life, a moral task. And when we fulfill it, we grow in a, you could say, spiritual way, or you could say our soul grows. This is not a language Fichte would use, but just to give you a quick sense of what he means. And we go on to another life. I'm not talking necessarily of reincarnation here in the same world, rather another life in a sort of higher plane of existence. But it's not a life of rest, quite the contrary, it's a life of even more activity. We get a new task there, one that is bigger, one that is more challenging than the task we had down here on this earth. And once we did that, we go on to the next life, and so on, growing ever closer to God, but never actually getting to a point where the activity ceases and where we rest. On the opposite, rather becoming ever more active. So, depending once again on whether you're weak or whether you're strong, on whether life feels overwhelming to you or you embrace life, you will dream of a very different sort of happiness. And so Kant would say happiness doesn't have to come through passively receiving and consuming good feelings. Happiness can also come from being active, from doing something. Indeed, Kant says the highest happiness, the highest pleasure, is the one I created for myself. And he also says the value of life lies in the degree of activity. The more passive we are, the less value does our life have. The more active we are, the more value does it have. Sure, many people don't quite understand that. Many people cannot fathom getting happiness out of activity, out of something that is challenging, out of something that is hard. There are, for example, many people who don't get it. I like to read challenging books that I don't have to completely force myself, because they would never do that. If they ever read any challenging book, then maybe it was because they were forced in school or university. But otherwise, they just want to read simple books that offer some escapism, that offer some rest from their daily life, if even that. Of course, many wouldn't like to read books at all, not even the most superficial ones. But what they don't get is that when they are talking of chilling, of relaxing, of taking a break, what the abundant, the strong person hears will just be boredom. And to such a person, that will not seem very pleasurable. That will not seem to be something you should strive for. Kant acknowledges that, sure, work, any sort of work, I'm not talking about a job, about work to get money necessarily, any sort of work means a sort of hardship or difficulty or tribulation. Indeed, in German, the word for work, Arbeit, 1,000 years ago in Middle High German, it still used to have the meaning of struggle. Nowadays it means work. Back then it meant struggle. So yeah, work is a struggle. Kant acknowledges that, but he says that work is different from all other struggles in that it births hope, right? Other struggles, they are just hardships, they are just painful, and they make you suffer because there's no meaning to it and there's nothing good coming out of it. But when you work, you have hope, because something is coming out of it eventually. Whether it's the money you earn, whether it's something you produce, like when you craft something, for example, right? When you work on a painting or a statue or whatever, the struggle is worth it, because you have this hope that something will come out of it. But since Kant says, okay, there's its own sort of pleasure that is not a passive pleasure, but rather that comes from us being active, from us doing something, we can now ask, how is this possible? How can activity create pleasure? And here you should turn back to the lecture I gave about what Kant has to say about pleasure and pain, because his theory of pleasure and pain very much explains that. I said there that to him, pleasure is a feeling of our life being increased, so to say, our vitality growing. While on the other hand, when something feels painful, we are feeling that our vitality is threatened, that our vitality in some sense is being reduced. So the more alive you feel, the more good you feel about yourself, the more happy you are. And if, as I already said, life as such is activity, life as such means moving yourself, and on the other hand, the more passive, the more unmoving you are, the closer you get to something that is dead, just a dead lump of matter, then it makes perfect sense that in activity you feel your life the most, and therefore you feel the most pleasure, which is precisely why Kant says we feel pleasure when we are moving, not just when we are sitting around. But you can get even deeper into Kant's theory of pleasure and pain. And here I can point you to my lecture about the sublime, where I explained that to Kant, an increase of vitality, feeling more alive, happens when something that blocked our vitality is removed. In other words, Kant says pleasure is not really possible without pain, because pleasure comes precisely when you remove pain, right? If you're close to dying from thirst and now someone gives you a glass of water, you will probably feel intense pleasure at drinking it. And as a regular person who has never been close to dying of thirst, when you drink a glass of water, the pleasure will probably not compare to what this person is feeling. In that lecture on the sublime, I gave an analogy. I said, imagine a river was capable of feeling pleasure and pain. And now imagine the river either flowing freely, would probably feel good about itself, but not intense pleasure. And on the other hand, imagine now if someone was to build a dam and to block the river, then that would probably cause displeasure, that would probably cause some sort of pain to the river. But if now the dam was to suddenly break, and all this dammed up water could pour out all at once, that would probably feel like a much more intense pleasure to the river than just flowing unhindered. So, in other words, when an obstacle to our vitality is removed, we feel our vitality growing very much, and that is causing us lots of pleasure. But now think about what activity, what work means. all work is work on something. You're always dealing with some sort of matter that through your work you're shaping. But this matter is always resisting you in one manner or another. And this resistance will cause some sort of displeasure to you. But as you overcome it, as you sort of win in your struggle with this matter and sort of subjugate this matter to yourself, that will feel pleasurable, right? It doesn't matter what kind of work it is. So if you're a stonemason, if you're trying to turn a block of stone into a statue, the stone resists you. It's hard. It won't turn into a statue just at your command. Rather, you have to actually hit the stone. You have to chisel the stone. But in struggling with the stone, in overcoming it, once you created your statue, you will probably feel pleasure. Likewise, if you are a baker working with the ingredients, with the flour, with the dough, there also you have something that doesn't just magically turn into cake. It resists you and you need to overcome it. Same thing if you are reading a book, if you are trying to understand a book, then in a way this content of the book is resisting you. You don't just automatically understand it, you have to struggle with it. You have to actually read it, you have to actually think about it, reflect on it. But as you gain more and more understanding, as maybe your abilities grow, let's say you're studying a language and you're actually learning to speak it, you will gain pleasure. Of course, the pleasure is dependent on a sort of success, right? If in your struggle the matter you're working on keeps resisting you, that might cause displeasure eventually, right? Let's say you're a programmer and you're trying to program something, and again it fails. Again and again there are bugs and doesn't work the way as intended. Eventually you might be fed up with it and kick your computer or whatever. So you don't want the matter to resist you forever. But if there was no resistance at all, if there was no struggle, then there also would be less pleasure. All of this, of course, is not just Kant. It fits perfectly with Nietzsche's whole philosophy of the will to power. Nietzsche would say it's exactly this. We have this will to power, so we want to struggle. We want to fight with some sort of matter. We want to subjugate something to us. We want to be victorious and to feel our power growing. And this gives us pleasure. And again, through Kant's philosophy of pleasure, it can be explained by the fact that pleasure is a feeling of our own vitality, of feeling alive, and by the additional fact that we feel most alive when something that previously blocked, that previously was an obstacle to our vitality, is taken away. That would be the one reason why you can gain pleasure or happiness from activity. To Kant, there's a second additional reason, and that lies in self-approval, because there is a pleasure that comes from being able to approve of yourself, right? There is a pleasure that comes out of reflection and being happy with who and what you are. And this self-approval can only come from activity, Kant says, because passivity does not give my life any worth objectively. It feels good. It gives my life passive worth, maybe, a subjective worth, but not objective worth. So this means, since I happen to already be alive, okay, I probably want to rather feel pleasure than pain in life. So I can say I would rather spend my life sitting around and eating tasty food rather than being tortured or whatever. But if the question is, why should you be alive at all? Again, since you already are alive, okay, sure, you want rather a pleasurable than a painful life. But if you had not been born at all, then you would also not feel any pain. So why should you be alive at all? A life of only passive, indulgent pleasure has subjective value to me. I like it. It feels good to me. But it has no objective value. So a rational being that looked at me from the outside, completely neutrally, that was to look at the world from the outside, so to say, like imagine God, if that being was to judge whether it is good that I exist, whether I should exist, such a being would have no reason to say, yeah, this life spent in passive pleasure, it's better that this life exists rather than that it doesn't exist. But if, on the other hand, I'm active, if I'm working, if I'm doing something, I am giving life meaning. Again, think of the stonemason, think of the sculpturer creating a statue. He can now say, okay, it's better that I was alive rather than if I would not have been alive, because when I die one day, my statue will remain. I have gifted something to the world. I have made the world as such better, right? So I have given meaning to myself, to my own life. And not only that, I've given more meaning to the world. Without me, this stone would just have been a stone lying around, having no inherent value. But now I turned it into a beautiful statue that actually has value. So I gave meaning to the stone just as much as I gave meaning to my own life. Therefore, I can approve of myself. And this self-approval, that again cannot come from being passive. Being passive, being pleasured, means you can enjoy the state you're in. You can approve of your state, but it does not mean that you can approve of yourself, of your person. This self-approval and this happiness of self-approval can only come from activity, can only come from doing some work that has meaning, that gives your own life and the world meaning. In the last 2 centuries of thinking, the insight that life is will to power and that there's a certain pleasure in being active, in struggling, in expanding, in overcoming, has been understood more and more with more clarity by various thinkers such as Nietzsche, such as Reich, such as my own dad. But you can find at least the dawning of this insight already in Kant. And studying Kant can therefore help to better understand it and to better understand, especially in our present time, that has a hard time thinking of any alternative to the passive indulgence, to better understand that there is an alternative, that there is a whole different way of being happy, of experiencing pleasure. And I just want to point out, as a sort of side note, that when you think of God, God is, of course, imagined as having the most happy, the most blissful, the most felicious state possible. There is no pain, there is no displeasure for God. But if you actually try to think about what this means, how this is possible, why God feels good about himself, then you could explain it through this, right? Because you could say, to God there cannot be the pleasure of receptivity, there cannot be passive pleasure. That would not be befitting. That would mean God is dependent on other things and how they affect him. No, Kant says God has no sensuality, he has no receptivity, he's completely spontaneous, completely self-active, so this pleasure cannot exist for him. Well, what is God's bliss then, if not the bliss of activity? God is the most alive, God is the most active. Indeed, if we go with Fichte, we could go so far as to say God is life itself, or God is pure activity itself. Fichte would stress that there is not first being, something that is something solid, something steady. That being maybe is God, and then that being is active. Yeah, so there's not an actor that does an activity, but rather the activity itself is the most fundamental thing. Without an actor, without an agent that does the activity, there is no being first, there is just being active. God is pure activity. And that would explain why he is pure bliss. And of course also why he can fully approve of himself, right? Why he doesn't have to feel good just about the state he is in, but about who he is, about the person he is, because he does something, and he, through doing something, gives meaning, gives the ultimate meaning, both to himself and to that which he does, to the world which he is shaping. So through this philosophy of Kant's, we could also better understand God's own blissful state, which would mean precisely that the more passive I am, the further removed from God I am. The more I degrade myself beneath my own humanity, the closer I become to a lifeless stone. While on the other hand, the more active I am, the more I live my humanity, the more I live as truly the image of God, the more similar I become to God, the more godlike I become by being more active. And that is precisely what Fichte would say, that as going through further lives, through higher planes of existence, we become ever more active, we become ever closer to God. Never fully becoming God, of course. To Fichte, it's about an eternal striving, but getting ever closer to God. I just want to point out one more thing, to clear one thing up, and that is that, of course, Kant does not say we have to always be completely active. As said, the unaufklärt person that seeks passivity, that seeks the Sabbath of Sabbath, is active, does work, but treats the activity just as a means to an end in order to reach a passive state. Well, for the active person, it's the other way around. Of course, this person also needs passivity, needs rest. For example, we need to sleep sometimes, right? But to this person, it is the passivity that is a means to an end. He doesn't work in order to be able to rest. Rather, he rests in order to regain his strength, to regain his power to work even more. And I also want to point out that Kant says we can even rest by being active. Resting does not have to be the same as being completely passive. Because after all, activity does not have to always be serious activity, does not have to always be work. Play, Kant says, is also a form of activity. And indeed, Kant advises that often when we seek rest from the hardship, from the struggle of work, it's better to rest by playing a game or by doing something social, by interacting with other people, having conversations. So in other words, Kant advises to replace activity not with complete passivity, but to replace one activity with another activity. Of course, this only works if the one activity didn't drain you too much, if you overwork yourself, if your work is stressful, then you cannot go on to another sort of activity. Then you will indeed need to just rest and be passive. But if you have a work that vivifies you, that makes your vitality, your strengths grow, then it is possible to go from work to another sort of activity that is less serious, less focused, but still activity. And Kant recommends this. He says this is something that does not make us grow numb, right? Just indulging. If we just eat the same food, for example, eventually we will not enjoy it as much anymore. But meeting with our friends, doing social activities, Kant says this is something we will keep enjoying. And on top of that, it is also something that cultivates us, that refines us as people, makes us more tactful, makes us more tasteful. So in other words, Kant says that through this, resting through activity, we are also perfecting ourselves and therefore working on the moral duties towards ourselves. I gave a lecture on these duties. They are very important to Kant. To him, we don't just have duties towards others, we have a duty towards ourselves to become ever more refined, ever more perfect human beings. And therefore, he would recommend that even when we are seeking rest, we should often not seek a completely passive, but a sort of active rest. But with that, I'm at the end of talking about what Kant has to say about the positive way of attaining happiness through activity. And with that, I also get to the end of this overall topic of what Kant has to say about happiness and about the good life. I already pointed out when starting this topic of happiness that here Kant is less original than other parts of his thinking. That here, to get these insights, you don't necessarily have to study Kant. You could also study certain other thinkers, even thinkers from antiquity. I gave 2 whole lectures pointing out how close Kant is in some of his judgments and sentiments to the ancient Stoics and to the ancient Epicureans. But that in itself is also an important insight, I believe. That when it comes to the question of what is a good life, how to live a good life, for more than 2000 years, more or less all great thinkers, more or less all wise people have agreed. When you compare what Kant has to say here with, on the one hand, the thinkers of antiquity. Doesn't just have to be the Stoics or Epicureans. You could also look at Aristotle or at the Cynics. And on the other hand, compared with what our current time believes about happiness, then you will find that while in time, by number of years, Kant is of course much closer to our day and age than to antiquity, in his thinking, in his judgments, in many ways he's closer to the ancient thinkers than to our time. And I think it's important to realize that in order to understand how deep the historical rupture is that has happened in modernity. How certain things that have been taken more or less for granted by all thinking people for millennia are no longer taken for granted. And here I want to point out that when it comes to the good life, there has for a long time been an understanding on what philosophy is about. People used to talk about the philosopher in the singular, like saying the philosopher teaches this or that, the philosopher behaves in this or that manner, because for a long time there was this shared ideal of the wise person, of the sage, and this shared ideal of how such a person would behave in life. And people actually believed that it was possible to realize this ideal, right? People actually believed that such sages had existed. That, let's say, Socrates or Confucius or Lao Tse had really been wise people in this sense. And whether people were thinking of the yogi or the Sufi master or the Zen monk or an ancient Stoic or Pythagorean philosopher, whatever they imagined a wise person as, but they did have this shared belief that wise people actually exist or actually had existed, and that there is a certain posture of the wise person that allows you to speak of the philosopher in the singular. And even in Kant's days still, and a bit beyond, in the 18th and also in the 19th century, it was still possible for someone who was not a philosopher of profession, maybe also didn't deal with philosophy in a scientific sense, didn't deal with metaphysics, but to live life in a certain manner, with a certain equanimity, with a certain modesty, with a certain calmness and serenity and cheerfulness, not easily being moved, not easily having mood changes, being able to deal with whatever happened to him. Even in the 19th century still, people would sometimes call such a person a practical philosopher, meaning someone who acts like a philosopher, even if he doesn't think like a philosopher. And this has completely been lost. I know that because I myself happen to be the son of such a practical philosopher. And any person who met my dad without being completely untouchable and completely armored up would recognize this. His cheerfulness, his serenity, his wisdom. Like, be it my friends, being my dad's patience, they would all recognize this. But no one would usually express it would usually describe it by calling my dad a practical philosopher. So clearly this ideal of the philosopher in that sense has been lost. We live in a world that does not have a concept of the philosopher as someone living with a certain posture. I mean, we live in a world that in general does not have much concept of what a posture means and does not have much sense for people's postures. Our world is very much focused on the surface, on the facade, on titles and offices, and not so much on the inner posture that someone goes through life with. Today, nobody speaks anymore of the philosopher. People only speak of philosophers in the plural, as if there are many and as if they are different, just like any other sort of people that have nothing in common except all belonging to the same category. And if you ask what makes the philosophers, since they are so different, what makes them all philosophers, people will be hard pressed to give a proper answer. Nowadays, people will call people philosophers either as a mere job description. So the philosopher is, for example, the one who teaches it as university. That's, of course, especially ridiculous because the whole history of philosophy, from Socrates and Plato fighting with the sophists, all the way till Nietzsche, or now till me, the whole history of philosophy is again and again the actual philosophers saying those people whose job it is to think or to reason or whatever, they precisely are not philosophers. They have nothing to do with us. But either it's that, either people use philosopher as merely a job description, or on the other hand, they will call anyone a philosopher who thinks about things, who thinks about, I don't know, the meaning of life or whatever, and who comes up with opinions, which of course is not philosophy, it's philodoxy. It's not the love of wisdom, it's the love of opinion, probably of your own. So there's no proper concept of the philosopher nowadays. And admittedly, if you look at the more recent history of thinking and the people that have been called philosophers in more recent times, it's easy to be led astray, to gain a relativistic opinion of philosophers, to think that philosophers are also just regular people, maybe with some interesting thoughts, but regular people that are just as pathetic and just as stupid and just as incapable of living life properly as regular people, right? I mean, you will find someone like Schopenhauer with all his bitterness and resentments and his rejection of life and his pettiness, putting his lectures on the same time as Hegel's lectures so students couldn't visit both, or getting angry, screaming at a serving woman so much that she was in shock and sued him over that. Or you will find someone like Heidegger cheating on his wife and collaborating with the Nazis. You will find the existentialists that turned their own depressions and suicidal thoughts and whatever into a philosophy. You will find superficial uneducated modern day materialists to whom philosophy is just making pointless thought experiments about brains in a tank or about bats or whatever. And you will find a whole army of academic so-called philosophers, of professors, whose whole thought is just harmlessness. and not threatening to this society, to this system, not radical in any sort of form. And this very easily can block your view when looking at older times and what for the longest time the word philosopher meant to people. And here I want to also point out that we are maybe in the first age that has no proper idea of wisdom. I mean, when do you ever hear the word wisdom? Even when studying so-called philosophy, I mean, properly what you're studying at university nowadays is just history of philosophy. Just like when you're studying literature, you are not becoming a writer, a poet yourself. But even when studying that, I mean, I studied it for 8 years and I barely ever heard the word wisdom. And I don't remember ever really discussing at university what is wisdom or how do we attain wisdom, or ever being taught that there's a common idea of wisdom that all philosophers share. And I mean, our society at large, who says that he's striving for wisdom? Who says that wisdom should guide us? I mean, previous ages all more or less agreed that we should be ruled by wisdom. Now, there was maybe disagreement how exactly that would work. Should the philosophers be the rulers as Plato's philosopher kings? Should they rather just advise the rulers, as Aristotle would suggest, as in a way also Kant suggests, who says just give the philosophers freedom of speech and then they can publish their works and the rulers can take note of what they have to say. But in one way or another, all ages would probably have agreed that the government should govern in a wise manner. This is lost. I mean, who, not even their own voters, would call any of our current politicians, of our current so-called world leaders, wise? But it seems to be no problem to the people that they cannot call their own leaders wise. And likewise, we don't even believe anymore that wisdom is possible, right? Back in the day, like in Kant's day, people would actually, for a large part, have believed that Socrates was a wise person, someone that actually was alive once, some real person had been wise. Nowadays, you would get ridiculed for believing that anyone has ever been wise. If anything, wisdom is only allowed in fiction, and even there, only in fantasy fiction. So, when there also exist magic and dragons and unicorns and whatever, because apparently to us, wisdom is just as fantastical as magic is. So, okay, maybe Dumbledore, Gandalf, or Master Yoda or Uncle Iroh are allowed to be wise, but no actual person or no even fictitious person that could actually exist is allowed to be wise. And all this very easily can obstruct one simple truth, which is that through various ages and cultures, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Pythagoreans, Plato, Parmenides, all the way to Kant and beyond, or in other areas, the Confucians, the Taoists, the Buddhists, no matter what disagreements they might have had on certain metaphysical questions. And sure, I'm not saying they're all in agreement about everything. Of course not. There are big disagreements. But all their metaphysical, all their theoretical disagreements aside, almost all of them, if you break it down, would more or less have preached a similar posture towards life. Almost all of them would have told you, do everything in moderation. Don't seek extremes, don't seek excess. In fact, don't get lost in sensual pleasures and indulgence. Rather live a modest life. Don't be dependent on earthly goods. Don't be a slave to your own desires. In fact, don't ascribe value to anything that is finite and fleeting, and therefore to anything in this sensual physical world. Ascribe value only to that which is infinite, which is lasting, only to the supersensual. And don't be moved too much by your fate, by luck or by ill luck, by whatever happens to you. And above all, do affirm your fate. Do embrace your fate. Do not reject it, even if it is a hard fate, even if it brings you pain. Above all, do your task in this world. However they would have described this doing your task. Whether they would have said, do God's will and not your own, or live with the highest responsibility, or live in a way that you can affirm your life, that you can want your life to eternally repeat, or live according to nature and in harmony with nature and with your place in the universe, or live according to the Tao, or live rationally, or do your moral duty. However they would have described it, they all would have said, don't just follow your whims, don't just follow your basic animal desires, rather do what you are really here for. And so, in that fundamental sense, there is a fundamental agreement between all the sages, which is precisely what allows us to talk of the philosopher, to say the philosopher in the singular lives his life like this. And if you don't live your life like that, then it doesn't matter what kind of thoughts you have, you certainly are not a philosopher. So that was important for me to point out, because I do want to stress in this history of philosophy of mine, I mean, I'm currently talking about Kant, and I will keep doing that for quite a while longer, but eventually I also want to talk about other thinkers. And I want to go against this current day relativism. I want to point out that it's not just a bunch of differing opinions where maybe you can pick out whatever you like best, but rather there is a perennial philosophy underlying it all, where they are all in agreement. And therefore, when you ask, what does Kant say about how to live a good life? One simple answer that you could give is, Kant says what the philosopher says, and what the philosopher has always said, and what therefore all philosophers say. But with that, I'm at the end of this topic that I spent my last few lectures on. And I'm also pretty much at the end of Kant's practical philosophy overall, having talked about his ethics, his philosophy of right, and now his philosophy of the good life. There's just one more topic left. That is the topic of the highest good. What is the highest good of all? That is a very important idea in Kant's philosophy. And that is what I want to close all my lectures on his practical philosophy that have been going on for over a year now. What I want to close them with. And I put that at the very end on purpose, because while this idea of the highest good still belongs to the practical philosophy, it is also what will lead us beyond practical philosophy. It is also what to Kant is the bridge from his practical philosophy into his philosophy of religion, which is precisely what I want to deal with after having talked about the highest good. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk Kubilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Kim Giamatti, Ellen Hansen, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.